Hello and welcome to Mickeyology. I'm Austin Wrathall, history teacher and lifelong Disney devotee, and today I wanted to share with you some ideas and resources that you can use to teach kids about ancient Persia using the movie Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time. This is a unit I taught many times when I did my history through Disney class, and when I first made the unit, I'll be honest, it was mostly just so that I could incorporate that movie into the curriculum. It was a movie that not a lot of my students had seen before, and the boys especially really liked it, and it was also kind of fun to tell them that we were going to watch this movie that was based on a video game, and a lot of the students loved video games. However, when I went to put the curriculum together to teach the Persian history behind it, I found that there was not a whole lot available. There are some resources available already about teaching the history of Persia, but from my experience, and I know this isn't necessarily everybody's experience, but from my experience, when we in the US teach Persia as a civilization, if we teach it at all, we make them simply the villains of Greek history. And I think that's a real shame, because there are a lot of interesting stories and people in Persian history that kids and adults would enjoy learning about. Persia was founded by a guy whose story basically mirrors the classic hero's journey. Persian emperors get a shout out in the Bible, and it had an army that used cats to conquer a city in Egypt. It has this huge epic conflict, of course, with the Greeks that a lot of people know. He's basically the Superman of Persia, the government system with the satrapies, the way that they were very tolerant of different religions. He's taken away from his family, he's hidden with these poor shepherds, he comes back, he takes revenge, he builds this great empire. Their massive army that was called the Immortals, the 300 at Thermopylae, and the Battle of Salamis, and the Battle of Marathon, and it's awesome. Next. So, here are some ideas and resources that I used to teach that history to my History Through Disney class, and I hope that you find some things that will help you and your kids to discover the fascinating aspects of this too often overlooked civilization. Persian history. The world history standards often require teachers to teach about the Persian Empire among other civilizations. The Persian Empire has a lot of interesting history your students may enjoy, especially if you incorporate Prince of Persia into your instruction. There are several resources available for teaching the history of Persia, and you should decide how deep you want your students to explore the topic and choose your resources accordingly. Regardless of how deep you require students to dive into this topic, though, I highly recommend teaching them that Persia was not a single empire, but several, with different groups taking power at different points in Persia's history. If you've seen my When and Where video about Prince of Persia, you'll know that the movie doesn't even take place in the original Persian Empire, but rather a later empire called the Sasanian. If you want your students to get an overview of the various Persian empires, there are several ways you could do that. For my students, I created a slideshow that outlined the basic history of Persia, focusing on the Achaemenid Empire, and it covered everything from its founding through its conquest by Alexander the Great. I'm including a link to this slideshow in the description. This allowed the students to learn the stories of Persia's founding, to learn about the various emperors and their conquests, and to learn about Persia's rivalry with the Greeks. Afterwards, I would split students into groups, and I instructed each group to prepare a short presentation for the class about one of the great Persian empires. Each presentation had to include the name of the empire, a map of its territory, and 3 relevant facts or stories about that empire. This allowed students to do some independent research, to teach each other, which is always helpful, and it hammered home the fact that Persia was not a single continuous empire. This is something that, depending on your students' abilities, may be very helpful, although you may want to give them a few pre-approved resources to pull their information from before you have them teach the class. Persian culture. Even if you don't require your students to study the history of every single Persian empire, you will probably want them to understand the basic features of Persian civilization and how Persia differed from other ancient civilizations that existed at the time. This topic lends itself very well to a jigsaw activity because you can assign students or various groups of students to study different aspects of Persian culture and then teach each other. The topics I would always assign students to study in our jigsaw were the Persian immortals, the city of Persepolis, the satrapy system, and Zoroastrianism. And that was really nice because we covered Persian military, Persian government, Persian geography and architecture, and Persian religion. So you can get a lot done when you study this topic. If you don't want to prepare all of that yourself, I'm posting a document in the description below that has some readings that I pulled from various websites that I thought were at my middle school students' reading level, and those are the readings they would do when they did their in-class jigsaw. However, please remember that these are not the only topics that they could research. You obviously know your students best, so if you want to go further, you could have them research different emperors, different conquests, different places in Persia besides just Persepolis. And you could even go towards the modern day and have them research, modern day Persia, aka Iran, and how that compares to the ancient Persians and how they lived. Also, if you don't want to do a jigsaw, this also lends itself well to a choice board. So you could have the readings set up ahead of time and have individual students research a certain number of these topics and do a worksheet or report just on the ones that they studied, even if they don't study every single topic that you have outlined for them on the choice board. The movie. Of course, the part of this unit that students were always most excited about was watching the movie in class. Please keep in mind that Prince of Persia is PG-13, so if you do decide to show it in class, you'll probably need parental permission ahead of time, depending on your students' ages. Kids were generally very engaged with this movie. It was one that a lot of them had not seen before, and it has a lot of fun action sequences. However, to make sure that the students did stay engaged, I had all of them fill out a 10-question viewing guide with questions about the movie's plot listed in sequential order, and I am attaching a link to that document in the description. This movie is unique because it makes the Persians the protagonists, which, as I said before, is pretty rare because usually they are the antagonists in the Greek story. We see this in the 300 movies. However, I did want to make sure that the movie furthered their understanding of actual Persian history, and so for that reason I always concluded the unit with a presentation about what the movie got right and what it got wrong about Persian history. I am attaching the slideshow that I used in the description of the video below, and it's usually a pretty good debriefing presentation for your students and helps them understand the liberties that filmmakers took when they made this movie. They borrowed a lot of elements from different Persian empires and mashed them together to make the empire that we see in the movie. If your students are good at research, you might have them research for themselves what the movie got right and what it got wrong, and that could take the form of a presentation in class or a worksheet or report that you grade as part of your course. Depending on your students' ages, maturity levels, and abilities, it may also be worthwhile to discuss the casting of this movie. The film caused some controversy when it was released because Disney cast white actors like Jake Gyllenhaal in the lead roles rather than Middle Eastern actors in a movie that had Persia in its title. There were several news articles that came out around the time of the film's release, and there have been news articles released since about this controversy, so it may be worth looking at that topic if your students are interested in how media portrays different cultures, what exactly cultural appropriation means or does not mean, and the role of media in telling people's histories. So there you have it. Those are some ideas and resources for how you can use Disney's Prince of Persia, The Sands of Time to help students learn the history of the Persian empires. This is a very fascinating topic, and I hope you enjoy visiting it with your students. Please let me know in the comments if you found these resources helpful, and if you have any resources of your own that might help teachers guide students through this subject. As always, please like and subscribe, and thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.